Right, so the Houthis have hit another ship, and by now the world's shock looks as rehearsed as the press statements and inevitably followed in regards to that. Unprovoked, terrorism, threats to global trade, the usual drone of selected outrage over it. But this time it's different. The Minerva Grat, a Dutch-flagged freighter, wasn't just unlucky enough to be in the Gulf of Aden, it was named, targeted and hit as part of Yemen's ongoing campaign against Israel's siege of Gaza, a genocide the West refuses to see but can't seem to avoid sailing into. The Houthis warned, the ship sailed and the missile landed. Cue all the moral panic. Yet beneath the smoke is a truth far more uncomfortable than the tired old mainstream headlines repeat. The only people who seem to be enforcing international law these days are the ones the West keeps calling terrorists. Volatile waterways. The Houthis were not claiming another act of random aggression, they were enforcing what they call a standing order now, a self-declared ban on navigation to Israeli ports and on any company that trades with them. The Minervagracht attack was, in their words, a response to the continued blockade of Gaza and to the complicity of companies trading with the Zionist entity. Western governments called it terrorism. Yemen called it enforcement, and between those two definitions sits the moral collapse of a global system that protects ships more fiercely than it protects children. Since 2023, the Houthi movement has treated the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden as extensions of the Gaza battlefield. Their communiques describe their campaign as support for the oppressed Palestinian people and as an effort to make the blockade of Gaza too costly to ignore. They first announced a ban on entry to ports of occupied Palestine, defining these as the Israeli ports of Haifa, Ashdod and Eilat. The ban, they said, applied to all ships owned by or dealing with companies trading with the Zionist entity. That declaration was, as we know, followed by action. Missiles, drones, seaborne explosives hit or threatened a growing list of vessels judged to have Israeli connections. The logic runs in a fairly straight line as well. Israel's blockade of Gaza is illegal under international humanitarian law. States that enable it are complicit. Commercial firms that maintain trade routes to Israeli ports sustain that blockade economically. Therefore, striking those routes is not an aggression, it is counter-blockade. It is enforcement by those excluded from the law. A message that says if the international community refuses to uphold its own humanitarian rules, someone else will. The Minervagracht strike was thus a punishment, not an accident. It told the global shipping industry that the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden now operate under a new moral jurisdiction, one imposed not by treaties, but by defiance. Splithoff, the Dutch shipping group that owns the Minervagracht, operates a large fleet of multi-purpose cargo vessels serving global routes. The Houthis accused it of breaching their entry ban by allowing vessels under its ownership or management to dock at Israeli ports. The Joint Maritime Information Centre initially said the vessel had no apparent ties to Israel, though it later stated that affiliations were under review. The company has denied wrongdoing, though, and confirmed that it is coordinating salvage and recovery efforts. What the Houthis allege is a bit broader, though. They've previously circulated lists naming more than 60 shipping companies they claim that have traded with Israel. Inclusion on that list does not require proof of a specific voyage. It's enough that the company or one of its affiliates has serviced Israeli ports. Ambiguity, arguably, is part of the design here. By keeping the criteria vague, the Houthis can ensure that ship owners have always got to assume the worst. The point is not precision, it's about deterrence. Every company must now decide whether docking in Haifa or Ashdod, they can't even get to Eilat anymore, Eilat's basically bankrupt, is worth the risk of a missile. And that moral intimidation has worked before. After the attack on the Eternity Sea back in July, several carriers quietly rerouted away from Israeli ports. The Houthis have learned they do not need to destroy fleets, they only need to frighten the insurers. Until the middle of this year, most Houthi operations occurred within the Red Sea, of course. The Minervagracht strike changed that geography. This was different. This happened in the Gulf of Aden, about 1,000 kilometres further east, showing that Houthi missiles can not only reach open sea targets, but they're prepared to strike further afield now too. Naval observers have described this as a major escalation. It signals that Yemen's forces have expanded both range and intent, no longer striking opportunistically, but enforcing a strategic doctrine and geography is on their side in that. The goal is to make every approach to the Suez Corridor a potential hazard now. Each step they have taken has widened the field of engagement from nearby waters to distant ones, from demonstrative disruption to deliberate punishment. The message to Israel and its backers is very simple. Every continuation of Gaza's siege is going to be met by widening disruption of global trade. Under the Hague and San Remo frameworks, only recognised belligerents can declare lawful blockades, and even then they have to allow humanitarian relief. Israel's blockade of Gaza has been criticised by the United Nations, the World Food Programme, multiple human rights groups, and more besides for breaching those principles as they blatantly have. And yet it persists, backed by Western governments, and insists it is a security measure. The Houthis' entry ban essentially reverses that blockade. They claim to be enforcing humanitarian law, not violating it, but because they're not a recognised state, their actions remain illegal under the same framework they invoke, thus making a complete mockery of the entire legal picture. When Israel blocks civilians, it's described as military necessity. When Yemen blockades commerce, it therefore becomes labelled terrorism. The principle is consistent only in its bias. One Western diplomat told reporters that freedom of navigation is a global right and must be defended, referring to the Minervagracht incident. The statement captured the problem, though, in one sentence. The same governments that invoke freedom of navigation for cargo ships do nothing to secure freedom of survival for the people of Gaza. The world protects ships from danger, not kids in hunger. The law cannot reconcile that oppressive and depraved hypocrisy. Its moral authority is non-existent. Every missile fired in the Red Sea has an economic echo as well. Insurance premiums for vessels transiting the region have soared. Several major shipping lines around the world have already diverted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks of travel time and millions in costs. Nobody's shedding a tear for Israel over their increased expenditure now, except for the most ardent of Zionists. The Minervagracht attack widened that risk further. The Gulf of Aden had been considered relatively safer than, say, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait or the Red Sea. But that illusion has now been ended. The war risk zone has effectively doubled now, and with it the financial cost of indifference. This is asymmetric leverage. Yemen cannot on paper compete militarily with the likes of Israel or NATO. They'll give it a damn good go, I'm sure, but it can turn moral outrage into economic disruption. Every company must now choose between profit and principle. The consequences extend far beyond Israel. Rising costs hit global supply chains, food prices and fuel imports. But that, the Houthis argue, is the unavoidable cost of forcing the world to confront a genocide it prefers to keep on trying to ignore. The Netherlands immediately called for European Union sanctions on the Houthis over this. EU officials echoed the United States in condemning the strike as an attack on international trade and maritime security. Israel responded with further airstrikes on Houthi sites in Yemen, particularly around Hadida. Those raids on civilian areas confirming Israel's depravity still further. For the Houthis, these reactions are confirmation rather than deterrence, so every Western press release about freedom of navigation is treated in their media as proof that the West values cargo more than conscience. In Sana's view, moral authority lies not in compliance with international law, but in resistance to it, given how it is blatantly failing. The reporting divide tells its own story. When a Houthi missile strikes a cargo ship, headlines read terrorism at sea or threat to global trade. When Israel blocks aid convoys or bombs Gaza's port infrastructure, it's described as self-defense. That selective vocabulary conditions public perception. The Houthis exploit it deliberately. By striking vessels linked, however tenuously, to Israel, they force the Gaza war back into Western news through the shipping pages. Each explosion at sea becomes a headline that leads inevitably to a question about why this is happening. The attack also reveals a strategic reality. Power is no longer monopolised by states. The Houthis have shown that a non-state actor operating from one of the poorest countries on earth can paralyse international shipping lanes and alter global insurance markets. Their objective is not destruction but deterrence through unpredictability. They do not need to sink every ship. They need only convince the world that any ship might be next. That uncertainty, backed by ideological certainty, gives them leverage that bombs alone can never achieve. And for Israel and its allies, the dilemma is unsolvable within the existing framework. Retaliation reinforces the Houthis' narrative of defiance. Inaction exposes their own impotence, and they just can't beat them either way. Goodness knows they've tried, and they keep trying. But the Houthis will always come back. As long as Gaza remains under blockade, every ship that sails towards its besiegers becomes a potential target of moral reprisal. The moral question raised by the Minervagracht is not whether the Houthis are justified, it is why the international system has created conditions where their logic now resonates. If global law cannot restrain a blockade that starves civilians but can mobilise fleets to protect trade, then that law has lost its legitimacy. When authority collapses, enforcement migrates to the margins. The Houthis occupy that void now, not because they're lawful necessarily, but because the lawful have become complicit. Every ignored civilian death in Gaza adds another justification for potential violence at sea. So seen in that sequence, the Minervagracht attack is part of a continuum stretching all the way back to late 2023. As civilian deaths in Gaza rose and Western governments continued supplying arms to Israel, Yemen declared itself a participant in the moral struggle. And over the last 20 months, the Houthis have transformed from a domestic insurgency into a regional actor wielding global leverage. Their campaign functions simultaneously as military disruption and political defiance, intended to claim leadership of the Palestinian cause while traditional Arab governments remain silent and twiddle their thumbs. And it's worked. Each new attack provokes outrage and media coverage, but also grudging respect for their audacity, and much respect amongst audiences. Yemen is impoverished and bombed to bits itself, but has still compelled the world's richest nations to divert warships and rewrite shipping routes and still fail to stop them. That's power derived not from resources, but from conviction. So who now controls the moral authority of the sea? The same governments that guard cargo cannot guard civilians. Can they still speak of rules at all? If a missile strike on a commercial vessel is an act of terror or the desperate enforcement of a humanitarian principle abandoned by the most powerful, how many links exist between Israel's siege and the Western companies that sustain its trade? And what happens when a movement born in siege learns to weaponize globalization itself, turning those routes of commerce into instruments of political retaliation? These are no longer theoretical questions. We're watching them play out. They're the conditions under which global legitimacy is being rewritten. For the Houthis, neutrality in the face of Gaza's starvation is collaboration. Their campaign redefines the maritime commons as a moral battlefield where silence is guilt. Companies are forced to choose trade with Israel and risk attack, or abstain and incur loss. Western officials still repeat the phrase freedom of navigation, but for millions watching Gaza's aid convoy stalled and its children starving, not to mention several flotillas seized in international water and its occupants kidnapped and abused, that freedom rings rather hollow. It protects containers, not lives. Israel's blockade denies Gaza access to the sea. Yemen's campaign denies Israel the illusion that the sea belongs to it. One side calls it terrorism, the other calls it balance. The rest of the world calls it an inconvenience until the invoices arrive. If the blockade of Gaza were lifted, the rationale for these attacks would evaporate, and the Houthis themselves have said as much. But if it continues, they're just going to continue and multiply as well. Silence from powerful states functions as permission. Every unanswered atrocity in Gaza becomes fuel for another strike in the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, or who knows where else next. The Minervagracht is the cost of that silence. It shows what happens when law ceases to restrain the strong and the weak decide to enforce justice themselves. The fire that consumed its deck was not born in Yemen. It was kindled by indifference in every capital that calls Gaza's siege self-defense. The Minervagracht is more than a damaged ship. It's evidence. It proves that law without justice invites defiance, and that when conscience is ignored on land, it re-emerges at sea. The world built a system where ships are protected, but civilians are expendable. Speaking of that flotilla, though, the victims of their latest kidnapping are enduring significant mistreatment for daring to try and deliver flour and baby milk to Gaza. Positively criminal acts in Israel's eyes. This has been particularly focused on Greta Thunberg, of course, so do check out the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.